On Saturday, January 24th, 2026, President Donald Trump threatened Canada with 100% tariffs against all its exports to the U.S. if it makes a trade deal with China Bloomberg, a statement that detonated across markets and diplomatic channels within hours. The announcement came via Trump's Truth Social platform, where he warned that if Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA, Al Jazeera. This wasn't random noise or political theater. This was the structural collision of three massive economic forces that has been building momentum for months, and the shockwave is only beginning to propagate through North American supply chains, currency markets, and the foundational assumptions about continental trade that have governed investment decisions for over 3 decades. What we're witnessing isn't a negotiating tactic gone awry. It's the mathematical endpoint of incentive structures, dependency ratios, and geopolitical repositioning that have been locked into motion since Trump's return to office in January 2025. I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice. This is an educational analysis based on publicly available information and historical precedent. The immediate trigger is straightforward enough on the surface. Last week, Canada reached a deal with China on trade of agri-products and electric vehicles, Al Jazeera, a strategic partnership announced by Prime Minister Mark Carney during his January visit to Beijing. The Canadian government agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the market at a tariff rate of 6.1%, a measure that had been in place before Ottawa put a 100% tariff on all Chinese EVs in 2024, CBC News. In exchange, China agreed to lower tariffs on Canadian canola to 15% by March and remove tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crab, and peas as of March until at least the end of 2026, CBC News. For Canada's agricultural sector, particularly the prairie provinces that produce the majority of the nation's canola, this represented billions in potential relief from punishing Chinese tariffs that had been strangling exports. For Carney's government, it was a calculated pivot away from total economic dependence on the United States, a dependency that has become increasingly weaponized over the past year. But the China deal was merely the match. The fuel had been accumulating for months. Just days before Trump's tariff threat, Carney delivered a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos that emphasized the end of the rules-based international order and outlined how Canada was adapting by building strategic autonomy while maintaining values like human rights and sovereignty. World Economic Forum. The speech, which received a standing ovation at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting Wikipedia, represented something far more significant than diplomatic rhetoric. Carney declared that middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu, and warned about coercion by great powers. World Economic Forum, never mentioning Trump by name, but leaving absolutely no ambiguity about the target of his message. This wasn't subtle. The speech is widely considered to be a veiled denunciation of American ambitions for territorial expansion and aggressive trade wars pursued under the second presidency of Donald Trump. Wikipedia. Trump's response was equally unsubtle. After the Davos speech, Trump stated that trade talks with Canada were terminated in October 2025, ABC News, and later revoked his invitation to Carney to join the president's Board of Peace that he is forming to try to resolve global conflicts. Yahoo! The diplomatic rupture was complete, and it happened in full view of global financial markets. The scale of what's at stake cannot be overstated. Canada was the third largest source of U.S. goods imports in 2024 at $412 billion, and the top destination for U.S. goods exports at $350 billion, Congress.gov. According to Statistics Canada data for 2024, Canada exported 76% of its goods to and imported half of its goods from the United States, Congress.gov. This is not a symmetric relationship. Canada's economy is structurally dependent on American market access to a degree that has no parallel among major developed economies. Nearly $3.6 billion Canadian worth of goods and services cross the border each day. with about 60% of U.S. crude oil imports coming from Canada, as are 85% of U.S. electricity imports NPR. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the U.S. NPR. A 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States would not be a trade adjustment. It would be an economic decapitation. The math is brutal and unavoidable. Canadian exporters who currently enjoy relatively free access to American markets under USMCA would face effective prohibitive barriers overnight. Supply chains built over decades would snap. Manufacturing facilities optimized for continental integration would find themselves stranded on the wrong side of a tariff wall that makes their cost structures fundamentally uncompetitive. The automotive sector alone exemplifies the depth of integration and vulnerability. A single automotive part may cross a border 7 or more times during production Whipfly LLP, with value added at each stage across multiple jurisdictions. 100% tariff doesn't just increase costs, it obliterates the business model. But here's what makes this structural rather than merely painful. The threat comes at the precise moment when Canada faces the most consequential trade negotiation in its modern history. In July 2026, on the 6th anniversary of the USMCA's implementation, the three countries will hold a joint review to assess the agreement's performance and determine its future Center for Strategic and International Studies. If all parties agree to renewal, the agreement will remain in force for another 16 years, with a review in 2032 Center for Strategic and International Studies. However, if any party refuses to extend, there are another 10 years until 2036 when the parties can seek to reach agreement on extending the USMCA's term, and failure to reach agreement by 2036 will result in the termination of the USMCA Brookings. This timing is not coincidental. Trump's tariff threat lands exactly 6 months before the USMCA review, at the moment when Canada's negotiating position is most vulnerable and when the United States has maximum leverage. What was once expected to be a routine assessment aimed at improving implementation is now likely to become a high-stakes negotiation, with the Trump administration poised to seek additional concessions from Mexico and Canada on long-standing trade disputes, while also leveraging the review to address non-trade issues such as migration, drug trafficking, and Continental Defense Center for Strategic and International Studies. Canada approaches this review having just publicly pivoted toward China, having delivered a speech that positioned middle powers against American hegemony, and now facing an explicit threat that could eliminate 3/4 of its export market. The historical parallels are instructive, though the current configuration is arguably more precarious than past trade conflicts. During the original NAFTA renegotiation that produced USMCA, Canada faced significant pressure but operated within a framework where American commitment to some form of continental free trade was never seriously in doubt. Trump wanted changes to NAFTA, not its elimination. The current situation is structurally different. Trump has repeatedly suggested Canada should become the 51st American state, posted altered maps showing Canada absorbed into the United States, and referred to Prime Minister Mark Carney as Governor Carney Bloomberg. These are not negotiating tactics. They represent a fundamental reframing of the relationship from partnership to subordination. Most observers miss the deeper current because they're focused on the surface drama of tariff threats and diplomatic speeches. The real story is about dependency ratios and the asymmetric ability to absorb economic pain. When 76% of your exports go to a single market, you don't have alternatives you can activate quickly enough to matter. Canada has spent the last several months attempting to diversify, announcing a dozen new economic and security partnerships across 4 continents in the last 6 months, Prime Minister of Canada, including agreements with the European Union, China, Qatar, and various Asian nations. But diversification takes years to build the physical infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, and commercial relationships necessary to redirect massive export flows. Canada doesn't have years. It has 6 months until the USMCA review. The China deal specifically illuminates why this cycle accelerates faster than traditional trade disputes. For the last 2 years, Canada largely walked in lockstep with the US regarding Chinese EV tariffs. And following the Biden administration's move to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, Canada implemented similar surtaxes electric. Canada's reversal, dropping tariffs from 100% to just over 6% on a quota of Chinese vehicles, represents not just a policy shift, but a strategic realignment. It signals to Washington that Canada is willing to break with American containment strategy toward China when Canadian economic interests demand it. It signals to Beijing that Canada is available as a wedge to fracture American-led economic coalitions, and it signals to global markets that North American economic integration, long assumed to be the stable foundation beneath trillions in investment and trade, is now negotiable. Trump's response, threatening to immediately impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods, is the logical escalation in a game theory framework where cooperation has broken down. If Canada is pursuing independent arrangements with America's primary geopolitical rival, and if those arrangements could potentially allow Chinese goods to enter North American markets through Canadian ports, Trump's explicit concern when he suggested that China would try to use Canada to try to avoid paying U.S. tariffs, CNBC, then the cost of maintaining free trade with Canada has risen dramatically from an American strategic perspective. The tariff threat isn't irrational. It's the inevitable output of a system where trust has eroded and where the incentive to defect now exceeds the benefit of cooperation. This is where outcomes feel sudden, but are actually mathematically earned. The infrastructure for this rupture has been building since Trump's first term, through the contentious NAFTA renegotiation, through repeated threats to withdraw from USMCA, through tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum justified on national security grounds, through the deliberate humiliation of referring to the Canadian Prime Minister as a governor. In October 2025, President Trump stated that trade talks with Canada were terminated. Congress.gov. Each escalation created incentives for the next. Each demonstration of American willingness to weaponize trade access pushed Canada toward finding alternatives. Each Canadian attempt to find alternatives validated American concerns about Canadian unreliability. The spiral was locked in. The market impact operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The immediate effect is pure risk premium. Any company with exposure to Canadian exports to the United States must now price in genuine probability of effective market closure. This isn't a 5 or 10% tariff that can be absorbed through price adjustments or efficiency gains. 100% tariffs mean you need to find entirely different markets or fundamentally restructure your business. Canadian companies heavily oriented toward U.S. exports face valuation compression as investors rationally discount future cash flows by the probability of tariff implementation. Currency markets react to reduced export competitiveness and capital flight risk. In October 2025, exports from Canada to the U.S. fell 3.4%, and Canada's trade surplus with the U.S. was cut nearly in half from $8.4 billion in September to $4.8 billion in October. Global News, demonstrating that deterioration was already underway before this week's threat. The second-order effects propagate through integrated supply chains. American manufacturers dependent on Canadian inputs, energy, metals, automotive components, chemicals, face cost spikes, and supply disruptions. The entire structure of North American manufacturing is predicated on friction-free movement of intermediate goods. Imposing 100% tariffs doesn't just raise prices. It forces complete reconfiguration of production networks that were optimized over decades. Canadian sources are critical to U.S. energy security, with Canadian exports of energy products to the U.S. amounting to nearly $170 billion last year, almost one-third of total shipments, TD. American consumers would face higher gasoline prices, higher electricity costs, higher prices for any manufactured good with Canadian content. U.S. gasoline prices could rise by $0.30 $0.70 per gallon due to energy tariffs, Analyzify, according to estimates. But the deepest impact is confidence destruction. For 30 years, North American economic integration has been the reliable foundation beneath trillions in cross-border investment. Companies built factories, developed supplier relationships, and made long-term capital commitments based on the assumption that goods could move freely across these borders. That assumption is now in question. Once confidence in institutional stability breaks, it doesn't repair quickly. Investment decisions get delayed, projects get canceled. Capital that would have flowed to expand North American production capacity instead goes elsewhere or sits idle. The damage compounds. The common objection is that Trump makes threats he doesn't follow through on, that this is negotiating theater, that cooler heads will prevail. This objection misses the structural reality. Trump has often made bold threats, then either climbed down on them or let them lie, for example, never returning to the threat he made in October to hike the tariff on Canada by 10% over an Ontario anti-tariff advertisement, CBC News. But the pattern of partial implementation and strategic ambiguity is itself destructive. Businesses cannot plan around uncertainty. Every threat, whether implemented or not, forces companies to consider scenarios they previously dismissed. The cumulative effect is to raise the effective cost of integration even when specific tariffs aren't imposed, because companies must maintain redundant capacity, diversify suppliers at higher cost, and price in political risk that wasn't part of the calculation before. More fundamentally, the objection assumes Trump has incentive to back down. He doesn't. His political coalition rewards aggressive trade posture. His stated policy objective is to reduce American trade deficits and bring manufacturing back to the United States. 100% tariffs on Canada would accomplish that objective through brute force, regardless of the broader economic costs. President Trump promised USMCA would end the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico and Canada, end job offshoring, and raise wages in North America, rethink trade, and the USMCA trade deficit has grown massively, rethink trade instead. From Trump's perspective, the policy hasn't worked, which creates political pressure for more extreme measures. Canada's position is structurally worse than it appears. Carney has not yet reached a deal with Trump to reduce some of the tariffs that he has imposed on key sectors of the Canadian economy, Wikipedia, and existing tariffs remain in place on steel, aluminum, and other sectors. The USMCA review in July means Canada needs a deal, but Trump doesn't. The United States can live with the uncertainty. Canada cannot. This asymmetry in pain tolerance determines negotiating outcomes. The country that can tolerate disruption longer extracts concessions from the country that needs resolution immediately. The convergence point is unavoidable. Canada needs the USMCA extended to maintain economic viability. The United States can use the threat of non-extension or extension only with punishing conditions to extract maximum concessions. Canada's attempted diversification toward China gives the United States justification for harsh terms, framed as necessary to prevent Chinese circumvention of American tariffs. The China deal, intended to give Canada alternatives and thus negotiating leverage, instead provides Trump with the perfect narrative justification for economic punishment. Every move Carney made to strengthen Canada's position has systematically weakened it instead. What makes this particularly dangerous is the absence of institutional guardrails. During previous trade conflicts, there were established mechanisms for dispute resolution, panels of experts, appeals processes, diplomatic channels that could moderate extremes. Those mechanisms have been systematically degraded. Countries like Canada prospered under what they called the rules-based international order, but knew the story was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, and that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. World Economic Forum. The difference now is that even the pretense has been abandoned. Carney stated that the post-Cold War rules-based international order had experienced a rupture, not a transition. Wikipedia. When the rules are acknowledged as broken, outcomes depend purely on relative power. Canada has limited power. The forward path from here involves scenarios, none of them comfortable. In the optimistic case, this is maximum pressure before the USMCA review, designed to bring Canada to the table willing to accept virtually any terms Trump demands. Canada capitulates on the China deal, agrees to additional trade concessions, commits to alignment with American policy toward China, and USMCA gets extended with modifications favorable to the United States. Markets stabilize, trade continues, but Canada's sovereignty has been demonstrably subordinated. The precedent is established that the United States can threaten economic annihilation to extract policy compliance from its neighbors. In the intermediate case, negotiations drag through the July review without resolution. The USMCA enters the 10-year sunset period, where annual reviews determine whether to extend or let it expire in 2036. This means a decade of persistent uncertainty, during which investment in North American integration gradually withers because no company makes 30-year capital commitments when the trade regime has a known expiration date and annual renegotiation risk. Canada accelerates diversification efforts, but from a position of weakness and without sufficient time to replace American market access. Economic growth slows across the region as the benefits of integration erode. In the catastrophic case, Canada refuses to fully capitulate. Trump implements the 100% tariff, USMCA effectively ends, and we get a full-scale North American trade war. Canadian exports to the United States collapse. American imports from Canada spike in price. Both economies slide into recession. The political pressure in Canada becomes unbearable. Capital flees. Currency crashes. At some point, Canada is forced to accept whatever terms are offered because the alternative is economic disintegration. But by then, the damage is severe enough that recovery takes years. The mathematical reality is that Canada cannot win this confrontation on economics alone. The dependency ratio is too asymmetric, but Carney appears to be betting on a different calculus, one based on coalition building among middle powers, on demonstrating that resistance is possible, on creating enough disruption to American interests through supply chain breaks that the political cost to Trump rises. Ministers acknowledge the threat is serious, but said it only confirms Canada needs to stay the course with its strategy to move trade dependency away from the U.S. CBC News. This is a high-risk strategy because it accepts significant near-term pain on the theory that long-term independence is worth it. The question is whether Canadian politics can sustain that pain long enough for the strategy to work, or whether economic crisis forces capitulation before alternatives are built. At this stage of the cycle, with these pressures aligned with the USMCA review 6 months away and no diplomatic resolution in sight, the path toward serious wealth destruction is not speculative, it's structural. The integrated supply chains that support millions of jobs and trillions in economic activity are being stress-tested at levels they were never designed to withstand. Markets can price in modest trade friction, but they cannot efficiently price in the genuine possibility that the foundational trade agreement governing North America might not be extended, or might be extended only after a period of extreme disruption. The uncertainty itself is destructive because it freezes investment, triggers defensive repositioning, and rewards those who exit early at the expense of those who hope for resolution. Once these systems reach critical stress, outcomes unfold faster than institutions can adapt. The time to prepare for disruption is before it's obvious to everyone, before the cascade, when positioning still matters. We're watching a real-time demonstration of how integrated economic systems fracture when the political will to maintain them evaporates, when asymmetric dependencies get weaponized, and when the incentive to cooperate is overwhelmed by the incentive to defect. The mathematics of that process are merciless, and they don't care about historical relationships, shared values, or optimistic assumptions about adults eventually being in the room. The adults are in the room. This is what they're choosing.